This is U.S. History Lecture 3.4 on the 1970s. I wanted to start off here with just kind of a brief discussion of the highlights of the 1970s. The 1970s opens, of course, with Nixon, and the main thrust of Nixon was the withdrawal from Vietnam, with which he ran the campaign, with the idea that he would be withdrawing from Vietnam. He entered into a period of détente with the Soviets, and then, of course, the very famous Watergate scandal. We also have something that I don't have there on the highlights, but we're going to go over, which is Nixon's new economic policy, which was kind of interesting, albeit it wasn't terribly effective. Then, of course, we have Ford. Ford will take over after Nixon's resignation, and Ford's sole purpose in being a politician or at that level, at the national level, and his sole contribution to history was the pardoning of Nixon. Other than that, he didn't do much. And then we have Carter from 77 to 81. And the highlight for Carter was the institution of the Carter Doctrine, and we'll talk about that in the foreign policy reversals that come as a result of it. We'll start here with Vietnam. Of course, Nixon inherits the Johnson administration's position in Vietnam, and Nixon will take over in January of 69, and Nixon enters office committed to getting the United States out of Vietnam. And so he'll begin a gradual troop withdrawal from the very beginning and enter into peace negotiations ultimately with the North Vietnamese, and he'll be in office when the final U.S. troops leave Vietnam. The last U.S. troops leave on 29 March 1973. But before then, Nixon's going to do one of the more controversial things in U.S. history, particularly with the Vietnam conflict, and it's what ultimately will lead to the Kent State protests that lead to the students being shot. In the spring of 1970, Nixon becomes convinced that the only way to salvage the U.S. position long enough for the U.S. to negotiate a peace is to do something to try to stem the flow of military assistance from North Vietnam, much of which goes through Cambodia. And so Nixon, prior to withdrawing from Vietnam, will actually expand the U.S. actions in Southeast Asia and in Indochina by invading Cambodia. He'll send actually troops in. He'll begin with a bombing campaign against Cambodia to try to reduce their efficacy in supporting the Viet Cong and to stop the Viet Cong from using bases in Cambodia. It won't be terribly effective, but it is terribly effective in fueling the anti-war sentiment in the United States, who have been told that the United States is going to be withdrawing from Vietnam, and so the expansion of the conflict into Cambodia seemed as something of a contradiction. In December of 70, of course, Congress will withdraw the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And then finally, Vietnam will unify again in April of 1975. In April of 1975, Saigon falls to the North Vietnamese forces, and from that point forward, it will be unified. Nixon will announce the Nixon Doctrine in 1969. This is kind of in the wake of the Vietnamese conflict, and kind of is a partial explanation as to why he's committed to withdrawing the troops. What the Nixon Doctrine effectively stipulates is kind of a step back from the Eisenhower Doctrine, that the United States will no longer become directly involved in attempting to contain the Soviet Union and the spread of Soviet influence. And as you can see, it's a reaction to Vietnam. What the Nixon Doctrine is going to initiate instead is a kind of a system of proxy wars. Okay? It's going to be U.S. allies versus Soviet allies, with neither the United States or the Soviet Union becoming directly involved. And there's going to be a few early tests. The only one that we're really going to talk about is the 1973 October War in the Middle East. But again, it's a step back, and it will kind of initiate also Nixon's reassessment of U.S.-Soviet relations that will ultimately lead to détente. He will continue kind of in Eisenhower's footsteps, however, in manipulating the political situation in U.S. allies, or what the United States believes to be countries in the security interests of the United States. Just kind of a little bit of a brief background. Allende was the president of Chile. He always was, but began to appear more and more to be a socialist. And the critical event was Allende planned on nationalizing all copper interests in Chile. Chile, of course, is very rich in copper. They sit in the Andes Mountains. He actually attempted, after the nationalization, to create some sort of copper cartel, which, for reasons that we don't need to get into because it's fairly tangential, doesn't work out. It's because there's too many suppliers, to cut to the chase, to kind of ruin the surprise for you. But this is seen as contradictory to ultimately Nixon's new economic policy, more than just U.S. foreign policy. The nationalization of copper by Chile would lead to a price increase. The copper concerns in Chile were largely owned by American corporations, most notably Alcoa. And so actually it's even a throwback to Theodore Roosevelt and gunboat diplomacy that the Nixon administration is going to sanction a CIA wet squad to go in and assassinate Allende, which will be done in 1973. That will give rise to Pinochet, and Pinochet will rule in Chile and be guilty of, or at least be allegedly guilty by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, of just a host of human rights violations. Which is kind of we could say it's a return to that ABC doctrine that the Eisenhower administration had under the Eisenhower doctrine. Now, we want to cover this a little bit. It was the War Powers Resolution is going to become actually more relevant to us in the 1980s and the 1990s. The first invocation of the War Powers Resolution is going to be in 1983, in the wake of the Reagan administration's introduction to U.S. Marines into the Lebanese Civil War. We'll deal with that in the 1980s. The War Powers Resolution itself, which was passed in 1973, is really Congress's way of covering their ass for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. We should remember that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution of '64 authorized the president to use any and all means at his disposal to protect U.S. interests, okay, specifically in Indochina. The War Powers Resolution is going to reverse this, okay? It's not an amendment, okay, and it's one of the more controversial constitutional issues, okay, because under the Constitution, the president is given the right as commander-in-chief of U.S. Armed Forces to commit U.S. Armed Forces. He's not given the right to declare war, nor is he given the right to raise armies, but he is given the right to commit U.S. troops. The War Powers Resolution is going to significantly curtail that. First of all, whenever the president intends on placing U.S. troops in harm's way, into a hostile environment, okay, he has to notify Congress. After the notification, the president has 90 days to get congressional approval. After that, he has to begin the withdrawal of U.S. troops, okay? And as I said, the first invocation of this will be in Lebanon. It will be invoked against the Clinton administration in the Clinton administration's introduction of U.S. forces into Somalia, okay? Now, when it comes to the Bush administration in the 2000s, the introduction by the Bush administration of troops into Iraq and into Afghanistan was already approved by Congress, so it didn't bring up the War Powers Resolution. Nixon will introduce what becomes known as the era of détente with the Soviets, and it's a little bit of an overstatement to say it's the development of a more cooperational relationship, but it's certainly less confrontational. And there's a number of reasons why Nixon is going to launch into this détente with the Soviets. I don't know. Excuse me. I don't know that I'd go so far as to say that the Cuban Missile Crisis really had anything to do with it because the Johnson administration never entertained the idea of détente, and they fought kind of a proxy war with the Soviets in Vietnam. What I would say is that following that, it's a new strategic approach to containing Soviet influence. And one of the considerations in adopting the strategic approach, we talked about the Richardson's arms race model back when we introduced containment back at the end of the Second World War, when we talked about the introduction of the containment regime. We talked about this initiation of an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I introduced the idea of Richardson's arms race model, written by Lewis Fry Richardson, who was the first mathematical model in the field of political science. Well, one of the key variables in that model is essentially the ability to bear the cost of the arms race. Well, the Soviet Union, by 1970, really, the Soviet Union wasn't the only one feeling the economic pinch from the arms race. The United States was too. Because what the United States was coming out of was they were coming out of especially Johnson's Great Society and the Vietnam conflict, which was running deficits in the United States, which ultimately we'll get to in the discussion of the new economic policy by Nixon that was creating inflation. This was creating inflationary pressures and putting a strain on the U.S. economy. Okay? So, in a sense, one of the things that's going to come out of détente is a reduction in the spending levels of the arms race. Both sides will benefit from this. This will be a condition, not that I'm going to get into it in any detail, but it will be a condition of what's called Pareto optimality. In game theory, Pareto optimality is a situation in which everyone benefits. No one is in a worse position. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a positive sum game. And détente will become this for both sides. Operatively, the most significant thing that's going to come out of the early days, anyways, of SALT or of détente is the SALT I Treaty, which is Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which will put a cap on the numbers of warheads and missiles that either side in the arms race can have, either the Soviets or the U.S. And more importantly, it's going to put a limitation on the use of anti-ballistic missile systems. Not, your intuition will tell you what an anti-ballistic missile system is. It's not that much of a stretch. There are missiles that shoot down ballistic missiles on their way in. Okay, they shoot the missile down before they hit their target and before the warhead can detonate. And while these are apparently a defensive weapon in nature, they have a very offensive implication. Because if we can construct an umbrella of anti-ballistic missiles such that any incoming missiles will be shot down, that really removes any disincentive to our launching our own missiles. Okay? And so it ultimately undermines deterrence theory. By instituting SALT I and the anti-ballistic missile cap at one per nation, and the United States put its outside of Washington, D.C. to protect the capital, and the Soviets put theirs outside of Moscow to protect the capital. By doing that, you maintain that disincentive to launching your missiles. It retains that idea that we talked about in the Eisenhower administration of mutually assured destruction. Okay, which for all of its various critics seemed to be effective in maintaining the balance between the Soviets and the United States. And we're now in 1972, so it's maintained the balance for some 25 years. Okay. Continuing on with détente, the other big move during the détente era was Nixon opening up full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China and opening up a trade relationship with China in 1974. Nixon's strategy, it's one of the more, when we do an American foreign policy, it's one of the more interesting strategic approaches to U.S.-Soviet relations during the Cold War. It's an interesting strategic approach. It's not a terribly effective one. Okay, Nixon will actually never really be able to use this triangular relationship. It's predicated on the basic idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, a little bit of background. When the People's Republic of China is established, Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, who is then chairman of the Communist Party and head of the Soviet Union, develop a very good friendship. Okay, they develop a very close working relationship. Stalin will send Mao technical support and capital in an attempt to develop an industrial base in China. Well, in 1953, Stalin dies. Khrushchev takes over, and in 1955, at the CPSU party rally, which is the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, at their party congress in 1955, he will publicly denounce Joseph Stalin and Stalin's programs, which Mao reacts to very negatively. He will actually boot out all of the Soviet assistance that he's been getting and sever diplomatic relations with them for a period of time. This is referred to in international relations as the Sino-Soviet split. Okay? Nixon will be the first president to try to exploit this. And it won't be terribly effective. The Chinese are never going to actually be used as a cat's paw against the Soviet Union. They'll never be used as a weapon against the Soviet Union. But it should be noted that the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union actually fought a series during the 1960s, fought a series of little brush wars in Central Asia against each other over territorial disputes. And the other thing that's gonna operatively come out of détente, which will actually be signed under the Ford administration after Nixon's resignation, is going to be the Helsinki Accords. And the Helsinki Accords are part of détente. There's nothing really new that comes out of them. The only new thing that comes out of them is formal recognition of U.S. and Soviet spheres of influence, specifically in Europe. Okay? After the Yalta Conference, which we covered way, way long ago in World War II, and again in the post-war environment, we covered it in that lecture as well, the Soviets were given as a sphere of influence. The Soviets were left in Eastern Europe. The Helsinki Accords are going to formalize that and recognize Soviet predominance of Eastern Europe. Okay? That's a concession. Now, the United States will be recognized as having preponderance in Western Europe. Part and parcel to the development of the Nixon Doctrine. Okay, and remember, the Nixon Doctrine is the U.S. is not going to become directly involved. Instead, what the United States is going to do is develop its alliance system, arm its allies to the teeth, and then we're going to have this series of proxy wars between U.S. allies and Soviet allies. This makes it critically important to support this alliance system. And as I mentioned originally when we first introduced it, oh, excuse me, the Central Treaty Organization, which was the inheritor of the Baghdad Pact, never really worked. It involved essentially Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey. Okay, it never really worked very well. It was always a very shaky alliance. And so the Nixon administration is going to develop a different type of system in the Middle East that I would refer to as the pillar system. U.S. security, U.S. national interests are going to be defended in the Middle East by a series of pillars. They're going to be built on pillars. Okay, primary of which will be Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Okay, this will be the time of the realignment towards Israel. The realignment towards Israel really begins in the latter days of the Johnson administration, but it's Nixon that's going to take up the gauntlet and reposition the United States behind the state of Israel. Now remember, before this, the United States was not particularly an ally of the state of Israel. This is going to change that, and there's a number of reasons for that. Okay, most notably, you see here. One, it's a strategic asset versus the Soviets. It's part of this pillar system. Okay, so you'll have Turkey, Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia that will be essentially holding up the foundation of U.S. interests in the Middle East. Okay? Secondly, Israel is a Western-style, it's the only Western-style liberal democracy in the Middle East. Granted, it was implanted there ultimately by the British. Okay? But nonetheless, there is a certain political coincidence between the United States and Israel. And then finally, and most importantly, the Nixon administration and subsequent administrations and subsequent Congresses become increasingly under the influence of the most powerful foreign policy lobby in the world. They're the second most powerful lobbying group in the United States. They're the most powerful foreign policy lobby, called AIPAC. That stands for the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. They start in the 1950s, okay, and they don't wield a lot of influence. By 1962, however, their influence is sufficient enough for then Senator John Fulbright to petition the Kennedy administration to place them under the confinement of the Foreign Agents Act. And this is because the members of AIPAC then, and many of the members of the AIPAC now, and many of the members of AIPAC through the years have been former members of the Israeli government. Okay? And so Fulbright felt that that should make them under the Foreign Agents Act. Now, the Johnson administration, 2 years later, is going to withdraw that. They're going to pull them away from the Foreign Agents Act. Well, by 1970, AIPAC is beginning to wield more influence in Washington as a lobbying group. And so domestic political pressures, which the Nixon administration always felt very acutely, are going to be brought to bear here. And we'll tangentially mention AIPAC again when we deal with foreign policies in the 1980s and 90s and into the 2000s. Now, as kind of a backdrop to what we're about to get into the discussion of the 1973 October War. While the United States is developing this pillar system, the Soviets are also making moves in the Middle East. And so the Middle East becomes a very active theater in the Cold War. Okay? First, as early as the 1960s, really, in the late 1950s, the Soviets developed treaties of friendship and cooperation. They developed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with Syria. And it's actually in 56, with the development of the Aswan High Dam, that they develop a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Egyptians. Now, this treaty of friendship and cooperation, I kind of put as a footnote there, will be ended by the Egyptians in 1974. The Soviets will be booted out for reasons that we're going to get into when we discuss the October conflict. One of the great misnomers is that Saddam Hussein was always aligned to the Soviet Union. That's, in fact, blatantly false. It's exactly the opposite. Iraq played kind of a neutralist position between the U.S. and the Soviets through the 60s and the 70s. They ultimately, when Nixon realigns the United States behind the State of Israel, Iraq, which was instrumental in intervening in the 1967 conflict against Israel and never signed a ceasefire, and has been an outspoken opponent, was an outspoken opponent of the State of Israel, will begin to lean more towards the Soviet Union. On to the 1973 October conflict. And for my money, the Cuban Missile Crisis is really played up as this great confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. But as we know from our study of it, it actually was a great game of bluff, because the United States knew that the Soviets were at a strategic disadvantage. For my money, the 1973 October War, and for anybody that really is involved in Middle East security, understands that in the 1973 October War, it was much closer to a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the reasons for that is that in 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis hits, the Soviet Union, and everybody understands this, all the players in the game understand that the Soviet Union is at a tremendous disadvantage in terms of capabilities, particularly strategic capabilities, which is to say the nuclear force. In 1973, that's not the case. by that point, Brezhnev has taken over in the Soviet Union and has really corrected for that disadvantage to a large degree. Now, just a little background. In the 1967 June War, Israel took control over the Sinai Desert, which was prior to that Egyptian territory. This will initiate what's known as the War of Attrition from 68 to 70. I mentioned it briefly in the lecture on the 1960s. Well, conditions heat up, okay, and the Egyptians use their Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with the Soviet Union to amass weaponry. And they plot with malice of forethought a preemptive strike, an offensive action against Israel to take the Sinai Desert back. The idea being that the Egyptians and the Syrians will place dual pressure on Israel. The Syrians plan on attacking the Golan Heights and taking that back, which was taken in the 1967 conflict. The Egyptians will push them out of the Sinai. In the initial stages of the conflict, the Egyptians are very successful. Among other things, what they do is they without getting into the details that much, they will essentially melt the Bar-Lev line. The Bar-Lev line was in the vein of the Maginot Line. If you've ever heard of the Maginot Line was a defensive system of forts between Germany and France that the French intended to block any German armies, and of course the Germans. And I guess we looked at this I think in epoch number 2 with the Second World War and the First World War. The Germans simply did an end run through the Low Countries and avoided the Maginot Line. Well, the Bar-Lev Line is very similar to this. The Israelis are going to build a system of forts on the Suez Canal in the Sinai Desert. Unfortunately for the Israelis, two things are problematic with this. One, they don't have sufficient force to properly man the forts, and two, the forts are built on sand dunes. And I don't know if you've ever been to the beach or if you've ever seen what happens to a sand dune when water is introduced to it, but it tends to just melt. Just prior to the invasion will begin on 6 October at 0600 hours. And just prior to that, overnight, the Egyptians will pump with hydraulic pumps will pump hundreds of thousands of gallons of water from the Suez Canal against the Bar-Lev line, and the forts will literally just crumble. The Egyptians will then proceed to undertake an absolute logistical masterpiece, and it stands as a record to this day in military history as the largest crossing of a natural frontier within a 24-hour period. Within 24 hours, the Egyptians will cross the Suez Canal with over 100,000 troops. And what amounts to an amphibious landing. It takes the Israelis completely by surprise. The Israelis are thrown back on their heels. Within the first 48 hours of the war, 25% of the Israeli Air Force is destroyed by Egyptian surface-to-air missiles, which were provided by the Soviets. Now, at this point, the United States threatens direct military intervention on behalf of Israel. They will, among other things, move the 6th Fleet into position in the Mediterranean and empty out all the aircraft and give them over to the Israelis to replace their losses in their Air Force. They'll pull out a large portion of the armor from Europe to replace the M60 force that the Israelis had launched in the initial attack by Egypt. And then they'll help to coordinate the Israeli counteroffensive. U.S. troops in Europe are placed on DEFCON 1 alert, meaning they're on the tarmac, so to speak. Their leaves are canceled. They're ready to roll in. And so it's the closest the Nixon administration will come to a direct military intervention anywhere. Now, and this is kind of one of the interesting things about the conflict. In an effort to reduce the tension between the U.S. and the Soviets are going to pull, I guess, a fast one. Okay, they're going to pull kind of a strange move. In order for the Egyptian offensive to move forward, the Egyptians need to replenish their surface-to-air missiles to give their troops cover from the now replenished Israeli Air Force. And it's actually going to cost the Egyptians the war that they don't wait. But the Soviets drag their feet on the resupply. They don't resupply them in a timely fashion. Political pressures are brought to bear. The Egyptians try to move beyond the high minarets, which are about 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers into Sinai Desert. And as a result, they'll be cut to ribbons by the Israeli Air Force because they have no surface-to-air missiles. This is ultimately why the Soviets will be booted out of Egypt in '74, is because they failed to assist Egypt in its hour of need. Now, for the Israeli counteroffensive, the Israelis originally try a series of uncoordinated counteroffensives, but ultimately they amass their forces, they replenish their supply. To their credit, they're able to reinforce their position effectively. They'll launch a counterattack. The Egyptians at this point have no surface-to-air missile cover, so the Israeli Air Force will have air supremacy and throw the Egyptian forces back, cutting out most of their armor. At which point it's now the Soviets' turn to threaten direct military intervention. They don't threaten it at first. The Israelis on 14 October will cross the Suez Canal and enter into Egypt and threaten the encirclement of the Egyptian Third Army, which is at the time about 40,000 strong. Negotiations begin at this point for a ceasefire. The Israelis refuse the ceasefire, and so the Soviets threaten direct military intervention. They do so by placing, very demonstrably, in other words, under the observation of U.S. satellites, rallying their nuclear submarine fleet, presumably to send to the Middle East. They also open up the silos in some of the Soviet missile bases in Kazakhstan, which is again seen by the United States. And so the United States sees that the Soviets are planning direct military intervention. The United States counter-threatens with a direct military intervention as well. And this is the closest that they'll be to a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The first attempts at a ceasefire are unsuccessful, the first of them being the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 338, which calls on Israel to stop its offensive, calls on a gradual troop withdrawal to return to their pre-war status, and it's refused by Israel, who at this point is is kicking ass and taking names. Now, the Arab reaction to the events, particularly after the Israeli counteroffensive and the failure to stop the Israeli counteroffensive, is to launch the OAPEC oil embargo, which is what we're going to deal with. We're going to end up dealing with this quite a bit over the next couple of lectures, because in point of fact, the United States is still dealing with the economic fallout from the OAPEC embargo. The OAPEC stands for the excuse me, Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. And they'll launch their embargo on 17 October 1973, and they'll embargo oil to the United States and to the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands is included because the Netherlands, a lot of people don't know this, the Netherlands is the spot market for oil. You can buy internationally, you can buy oil in a number of different ways. You can buy it on options market. You can buy it on the futures market. We won't get into that. That's the stuff for international trade and finance. But the spot market is kind of like if you imagine, going down to Walmart and buying something. That's the spot market. Okay. Well, Amsterdam is the spot market for world petroleum, and so when they embargo it to the Netherlands, it ends the spot market, and most oil is purchased on spot. And so this significantly reduces the supply of oil internationally, and will end up tripling the price within about 2 weeks, and will ultimately quadruple the price. This is going to lead to a series of price shocks throughout the world, most notably in the United States, and we'll deal with that when we deal with Nixon's new economic policy, because Nixon's new economic policy is largely hamstrung by these price shocks. This is also the threat of direct military intervention by the Nixon administration. This would have been the first introduction of U.S. forces in the Middle East since Eisenhower's decision to send Marines to Lebanon in '58, which was really kind of a flash in the pan. This will be the beginning of the U.S. war in the Middle East, and ultimately the war between the United States and the radical elements of fundamentalist Islam. And so one of the great myths is that the war with the radical fundamentalists begins with their attack on the World Trade Centers in September of 2001. In point of fact, that's not true. It was at least 30 years old at that time. And in fact, the first act of terrorism against U.S. assets will be undertaken in December of 1973. There will be a hijacking of an aircraft that will be blown up on the ground. That'll be flown to Honolulu and blown up on the ground. The October War ends with a ceasefire on 25 October. Kissinger, who was the one that negotiated the treaty in Vietnam as Secretary of State, will now negotiate a ceasefire between the main interlocutors, the Israelis and the Egyptians, and the Syrians, for that matter, as national security advisor. They'll then negotiate. We talked about UN Security Council Resolution 338, 338 through 340. Will deal with this ceasefire. It'll be a staged withdrawal of troops from both sides, and Israel will maintain control over the Sinai Desert in the ceasefire. And I'd already mentioned the building of the Bar-Lev line and the war of attrition. Now, we have a brief period, really from 75. Nixon will resign in 74. Ford takes over. Ford really doesn't, there's not an awful lot to say about Ford. The one thing that's kind of this oddball thing is the Mayaguez incident. A U.S. ship in Southeast Asia will be intercepted by the Cambodians and brought into a port in Cambodia. It's kind of a nothing, and it's resolved fairly quickly. But now after that we'll have Carter come online. Now Carter comes online and launches the Carter Doctrine. Okay, and the Carter Doctrine is really visionary. Okay, one of the things we talk about in American foreign policy is the 4 Ps. There are 4 Ps that serve as objectives in foreign policy, and it's not just American foreign policy, but it's power, prosperity, principles, and peace. Well, for the most part, the United States always put power and prosperity first. The Carter administration is going to put principles. They're going to actually stress American principles in foreign policy. And so you see what the Carter Doctrine says. No more support for governments not advancing towards democratization and human rights improvements. Now, this is visionary, to be sure, but it's ahead of its time. The strategic position of the United States at that point, and particularly the ongoing Cold War with the Soviets, really creates this as a problematic doctrine. Okay? What this means is that the United States is going to reassess its strategic commitments to many of its allies, many of whom are not moving in the direction of democracy, and many of whom, according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, are guilty of many human rights violations. The two that are operatively important to us here are the administration of Shah Reza Pahlavi in Iran and that of President Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. We'll deal with each in turn. Carter's going to begin gradually reducing support for the Shah's government, and the Carter administration is going to begin to receive intel that the Shah's government is not in a particularly stable position. There is a rising tide of fundamentalist Shia Islam rising up in Iran. And for the Somoza regime, you'll remember from our previous discussions that the Somoza regime was installed after the second U.S. intervention in Nicaragua. The U.S. will intervene in Nicaragua in the 1930s and implant, actually, Somoza's father as president of Nicaragua. When Somoza's father dies, Anastasio will take over. And so as a result of his lack of democratization and the various allegations of human rights violations, the Carter administration is going to begin to reduce the support for the Somoza government at a time when the Somoza government is also unstable, because from the early 70s on, they will be facing a populist socialist revolution from a group known as the Sandinistas. And in addition, kind of tangentially, the Carter administration will gradually begin a withdrawal of a lot of support from many of the U.S. implanted, U.S. established governments in Central America. This will lead to a series of foreign policy reversals, some of which are of catastrophic importance to the Carter administration. First, we have in 1979 a situation with which the United States is still dealing, will be the fall of the Shah of Iran. The Shah will flee and go into exile into the United States and die there. The Islamic Republic will be born under the command at that time of the first supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and they will establish an Islamic State. And from the very get-go, both sides, it's not that just that the Iranians are at fault here, but both sides sever all relations with each other. The Iranians blame the United States, of course, for all of the interventions in the Middle East. The Islamic Republic will immediately take an opposing view to the United States, and vice versa. The United States will also bring sanctions against Iran immediately. Iran will also declare its enmity for the State of Israel. The first move after the Islamic Revolution, as far as the United States is concerned, is that a group of Iranian students sympathetic to the revolution will seize the U.S. embassy and will begin the hostage crisis, which lasts for a little better than 400 days. It will last into the Reagan administration. The instant that the Reagan administration takes over, the hostage crisis ends. The hostages are released. Now in Nicaragua, the fall of the Somoza regime will collapse under the weight of the Sandinista rebellion, and this will lead to, not quite immediately, but certainly the Reagan administration will deal with it, the Contradora counter-revolution. The Contradoras are former Somozans, mostly security forces, who will try to retake power and knock the Sandinistas out with U.S. assistance. And it actually is going to put, when we deal with the 1980s, it's going to put the Reagan administration in a lot of hot water. It's going to create a constitutional crisis. The one, I guess you would call it a success for the Carter administration, is going to be the negotiation of the Camp David Accords, which will be a formal treaty that ends the 1973 conflict. It'll actually be signed in 1979, 6 years after the conflict concluded. And it will stand as the only actual peace treaty between between an Arab state and Israel. And you see there the conditions of it. It's negotiated actually by Henry Kissinger, who is back as Secretary of State under Carter. It will be negotiated between Sadat, the president of Egypt, Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Jimmy Carter, the President of the United States. The conditions of it you see there. Israel will withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. In exchange, Egypt will recognize the right of Israel to exist and forswear violence against the State of Israel. The treaty will be signed actually in Jerusalem. Okay, it'll be the only, Egypt will be the only Arab state then or now to actually have any diplomatic relations with the Israelis in Jerusalem. The Arab states refuse to accept Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. And it will ultimately cost Sadat his life. In 1982, while at the Egyptian celebration of the Free Officers coup in 1952, a coalition of high-ranking military officers and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is known as the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, will separate out of the parade, lob 4 grenades into Sadat's podium, and kill him, which will lead to the rise of Hosni Mubarak as president, and Hosni Mubarak will remain president of Egypt until 2011, during the Arab Spring. That's a little tangential for what we need, but this will ultimately cost Sadat his life. And the odd thing is that all 3 of them will receive Nobel Peace Prizes for this. Sadat is killed in 1982. Almost immediately, the ink isn't even dry on the treaty that Menachem Begin will begin systematically bombing southern Lebanon, And of course, Carter is pushed out of office in 1980. On to this new economic policy that we mentioned. Okay, now let's put a little background here. We're on to domestic issues. All right, in case you hadn't noticed, we've shifted from foreign policy to domestic issues. The new economic policy is an ambitious policy by the Nixon administration. Now let's review the situation that Nixon is facing when he comes into office. Okay? And I'll try not to get into too much of the technical details of the economics. But as a result of, really, you want to draw it all the way back. Go ahead and draw it all the way back to Truman. The Truman administration was the first administration to attempt to employ Keynesian economics to prevent a recession from happening. Okay? As a result of that, we have a series of budget deficits. Okay? These become particularly acute during the Johnson administration because the Johnson administration is trying to pay for the Great Society and, at the same time, pay for the Vietnam conflict. So these are creating inflationary pressures. Okay, you're increasing the supply of money. The U.S. government is borrowing money. That's increasing the supply of money. That's increasing inflationary pressures. Okay, now that's the one thing. Now the other thing is international. We talked about the institution of the Bretton Woods system, most notably the pegged exchange rate. The way that the Bretton Woods system standardized international trade, other currencies were pegged to one of two currencies, either to the US dollar or the British pound, which were themselves pegged to the value of gold. Now, they weren't exactly convertible. Okay? They were convertible in theory only. This is not the same thing as the gold standard. You can't run down to your bank and buy an exchange currency for gold. Okay? But what this meant was that all international trade ultimately is going to be conducted in dollars. Okay? Ultimately, all international trade will be exchanged for dollars. What this means is that as international trade grows, and international trade grows why? Well, a number of reasons, most notably the Bretton Woods system itself. The Bretton Woods system, among its many tenets, introduced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was designed to remove trade barriers between countries. Okay, so trade increases precipitously through the 50s and 60s. Well, as a result of that, you have a strain on the supply of U.S. dollars. To respond to this, the U.S. increases the amount of dollars. Now, at first, when this starts to take place after the Second World War, all the way through the mid-60s, you have what's known as a dollar shortage. Okay? Everybody needs dollars. There's not enough dollars in the system, and so you have a dollar shortage. Well, by the mid-60s, this has been corrected by the Federal Reserve, and you now have a dollar glut. You have too many dollars in the system. This is placing, again, inflationary pressures on the U.S. economy. To end all of this, the Nixon administration will unilaterally withdraw the United States from the Bretton Woods pegged exchange rate system. Okay? So what you want to think about is the U.S. dollar is the anchor of all other foreign currencies. Okay? When he withdraws that and refuses to allow the United States to do that anymore, it means that it's going to introduce what's known as a floating exchange rate system. And what the floating exchange rate system means is that currency, like any other commodity, all commodities in economics, okay, I teach this to my micro students, to my survey students, all commodities in economics, their value is determined by the supply of them and the demand for them. Okay, what the Nixon administration is hoping is that what's going to happen here is the dollar is going to devalue because there's too much of it. This will make U.S. exports cheaper to buy and improve the U.S. trade balance, which has kind of gone into negatives for several years. In addition, in an attempt to control for inflation, Nixon is going to introduce the Office of Price Administration, which is going to impose wage price controls. Now, we've looked at this before. In World War I, the Wilson administration did this. In World War II, the Roosevelt administration did this. This is going to be the first time that the government intervenes so directly and so pervasively in the economy during a time of peace. Okay? Nixon originally means for it to last 90 days. Okay? And the idea is it's in cooperation with the Federal Reserve. The idea is you control, at first, it's a 90-day wage price freeze. No price increases, no wage increases for 90 days. We will then allow a staged increase, okay, to try to control inflationary pressures. The Federal Reserve, at the same time, will increase interest rates gradually to slow the flow of money into the system. Now, it's originally intended to be in place for 90 days. It will end up lasting for over 1,000 days, because throughout, the economic analysts keep suggesting that as soon as you remove these, the inflationary pressures that you've been trying to control, this overabundance of money, is going to exert itself, and you're going to have massive inflation. Okay? August of 1971 is when he introduces this. Okay? And at first, in the first year anyways, it's relatively successful. Inflation is kept under control. Unemployment is kept under control. By 72, they begin this staged increase, and the pressure. It's kind of like if you imagine water in a pot, okay, under high temperature, gradually building up pressure to push its way out of the pot, and you attempt to release the lid of that pot gradually. The pressure comes out. Now, the idea is that what you want to do is you want to leak that pressure out so it won't boil over. Well, the problem is that he maintained the wage price controls for too long, and while he was maintaining them, pressure continued to build on the lid of that pot. So when he starts to really try to release that pressure, it's just too much. And so it's going to be very difficult to control, and you're going to have a gradual increase in prices, gradual increase in wages, okay? And then the last part of the new economic policy, and then in the midst of this, just kind of to finish it off, in the midst of all that, while pressures are beginning to build, you're going to have the oil shocks caused by the oil embargo in 1973, which is just going to blow the lid right off the pot. It's just going to, it's going to be an explosion, and you're going to have massive inflation rising. And that inflation actually by the end of the 70s will go into double digits. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And the final prong is a 10% tariff on imports to protect U.S. manufacturing. Now, this is the problem, and just kind of as a quick analysis to finish off the analysis of this new economic policy. That's a problematic thing to do. Tariffs, by their very nature, increase the price. A tariff is a tax. Long and the short of it, a tariff is a tax. It's a tax on imports. Okay? Well, under that protection, that forces prices to rise. So in the new economic policy, Nixon is trying, on the one hand, to control price increases with these wage price controls, but on the other hand, he's introducing this tariff, which is going to increase pressure. Okay? The last thing in the world you want to do when you're trying to reduce the pressure in a pot of water, pushing at the lid of that pot, the last thing you want to do is actually turn up the heat. Okay? That's just going to increase the pressure. And so this is a kind of a counterproductive idea. Now let's look at just a little bit at the technical economics of what's going to be the result of all this, of both the new economic policy and the coordination of it with the oil price shocks of the late 70s. And I put this up here now because what's going to be initiated is something that's a little odd, okay, in economic theory. Economic theory, and I don't know if you've ever been introduced to this, has a thing called a Phillips curve. Okay, and I'll cut to the chase. I'll make a long story short as best I can. But in orthodox economic theory, the suggestion is that inflation and unemployment are a trade-off. Now, let me pull out my handy dandy laser pointer here so that I can point to things here, all right? The idea being that high inflation is generally associated with the growth period of the business cycle, okay? In other words, everybody's out spending money. Producers are increasing production. They're hiring more workers. All of this requires more money, okay? All of this shifts the demand curve outward, okay? That is going to create inflationary pressures. So, inflation is generally associated to a growth period in economics. Well, if you're in a growth period in economics that would result in this inflation, you should, at least hypothetically, have very low unemployment. In other words, what's creating the inflation is everybody's out spending money, everybody's out demanding, that's pushing the demand curve outward. Producers are increasing production, they need more laborers, that's increasing demand on the supply of money. Money is flowing through the system, interest rates are low. The system is literally awash in money. That's what's creating the inflation. Well, you would think with all of that because production is up, producers need more workers, so unemployment will be low. Hence, we get the Phillips curve, okay? You can have really high inflation and really low unemployment, and it's a trade-off, okay? If we want to start to curtail inflation, principally by raising interest rates, reducing demand, etc., that's going to come at the expense of increased unemployment, okay? In other words, what we're going to do now is we're going to start to increase interest rates, dry up the supply of money. That'll force demand down because there won't be enough money in the system. That'll force producers to reduce production. When they reduce production, they don't need as much labor, and so they're going to start laying people off and unemployment will rise. And so as inflation drops, unemployment rises. As unemployment drops, inflation rises. That is traditional economic theory. That's the Phillips curve. Under a condition of stagflation, stagflation is a very strange phenomenon indeed. We're going to look at two strange phenomenons in relation to this Phillips curve. That's why I wanted to throw it up there real quick, okay? The two conditions in the 90s, and then again really under the Bush administration with the exception of a couple of times, we're going to have very low inflation and very low unemployment, which really shouldn't exist in orthodox economic theory. What we're going to have at the end of the 70s and the early 80s is the opposite. We're going to have very high inflation and very high unemployment. This again contradicts traditional economic theory. This really shouldn't take place, okay? I mentioned the oil price shocks, and we've been discussing that now for the last few slides. And it's really what's going to push the inflationary pressures over the top and cause the so to speak, to press the metaphor I've been using to force the lid off the pot completely. And I wanted to just get into the economics behind it here. What the OPEC embargo is going to do is dramatically drop the supply of oil internationally, okay? Well, that's going to have the effect of shifting the supply curve for petroleum upwards, okay? And you see the results here. You're going to have an increase in price and a reduction in productivity. Now, that's going to happen across the board for any industry that uses petroleum. And here's what you have to think about. Ultimately, every industry uses petroleum because ultimately everybody has to get their goods to market. How do they get their goods to market? This is why the Teamsters were the most powerful of all labor unions. Slice it however many ways you like it. You can bring it in by ship, you can ship it by train, but ultimately when it finally gets to the store, it gets there in a truck. Okay? Not to mention most trains run on diesel gasoline, most ships run on diesel gasoline. And so when they dramatically reduce the supply of oil, increasing the price of it, it's going to increase the price of all production. Okay? With the results that you see here, increased price, reduced productivity. And I mentioned this before, and you can read this here. This is to give you something hard copy to keep it fresh in your mind. As a result of the reduction in world oil supply, you're going to have ultimately what will be a quadrupling of world oil prices, the price of a barrel of oil. Okay, this is going to have a ripple effect that I've just mentioned. That's going to have a ripple effect throughout the economy. Everything is going to have a consequence as a result of this. Okay, well, you throw this on top of the pre-existing inflationary pressures with which Nixon has been dealing and trying to control, and it's going to push the United States off the cliff in terms of inflation. And so by the end of the 70s, you're going to have both double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment in a situation known as stagflation, which I mentioned a couple of slides back. In the midst of all this, as if this weren't enough, there are indications. One of the things that I never really had much use for, but actually is fairly useful, one of the guys that I studied with in graduate school, one of my professors, was from Ohio State University. Ohio State University is the epicenter of a subfield of political science known as political psychology. And there are indications that Richard Nixon suffered from an almost acute form of paranoia. Okay? This is the famous Watergate break-in. Despite all of these pressures, now we're back in 1972, okay? Nixon was a remarkably popular president. In 72, his popularity was at its zenith. He will end up winning the 72 election in one of the largest landslides in American history. Nonetheless, an organization is formed in support of Nixon, known pejoratively as CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. And it will orchestrate the break-in to the Watergate Hotel. Now, the Watergate Hotel is Democratic National Party headquarters, okay, for the 1972 election. And they will steal sensitive documents and attempt to plant a bug. And they don't get popped originally. They don't get busted at the original break-in. They get busted, like all criminals do, when they go back to try to cover their tracks. Okay, and it's two guys, Halderman and Ehrlichman, that are principally in charge of this. And it's never quite clear whether or not Nixon orchestrated this, planned it, ordered it, or whether or not he really even knew the details of it. Okay, that's one of the great mysteries of history. The consensual opinion is that given Nixon's personality, he did know about it and that he did order it. But that's an allegation. There's no actual empirical evidence to support that. And there's a reason there's no empirical evidence to support that. And it's because while it's unclear whether or not Nixon deliberately ordered this, it's very clear that he deliberately ordered the cover-up and obstructed the investigation. This is what's going to lead to the constitutional crisis, which ultimately will cost Nixon his job. So while it is not entirely clear, at least there's no real hard empirical evidence, although there are suspicions abound, whether or not Nixon actually ordered the Watergate break-in, it is very clear that he ordered and orchestrated the cover-up. Okay, the obstruction of congressional and FBI investigators. Primarily, as I'd mentioned, Nixon began to exhibit certain characteristics that would be consistent with paranoia. Among other things, unlike U.S. presidents, he taped all of his conversations in the Oval Office. Congress will subpoena these tapes during the Watergate investigation. And it's funny because I can remember the Watergate investigation. I was all of about 9 years old, but I remember seeing it on TV, the reports of it. And I can remember them grilling. They never brought Nixon up, but they grilled his advisors about wanting these tapes. And the problem was that mysteriously, they were able to present a lot of Nixon's tapes, okay, his conversations. But surprisingly, there were 13 critical minutes of tape missing. And of course, the suspicion is these are the 13 minutes during which Nixon ordered the Watergate break-in. Okay, we don't know because the tapes were mysteriously missing. Okay, this is what creates the constitutional crisis. The constitutional crisis isn't so much the Watergate break-in itself. They didn't really have hard evidence linking Nixon to this. Okay, they had suspicions, but no real hard evidence, and that is impeachable. Okay, it's a violation of U.S. law, breaking and entering. So that would be impeachable. What was definitely impeachable, though, was the presidential obstruction of the investigation and the refusal to submit to Congress everything they asked for. Reagan's going to face a similar problem in the Iran-Contra scandal. Okay, the Clinton administration will face a similar problem. Okay, for Nixon, in an effort to avoid impeachment, he was now at the point where they were really contemplating impeachment proceedings. In an effort to avoid that, he'll resign from office and turn the command over to his vice president, Gerald Ford. Ford, for his part, is really presented as a sacrificial lamb. Okay, early on in the days of Watergate, okay, in the 72 election, Nixon's running mate was Spiro Agnew. So when Nixon comes in for his second term, Spiro Agnew is the vice president. Well, in the very beginning days of the Watergate investigation, Spiro Agnew up and resigns from out of nowhere. Okay, Nixon will appoint a new vice president, Gerald R. Ford, who has no experience at the national level of politics, who was never elected to a national office. Okay? He's from Michigan. He'll be brought in. And he's brought in as a sacrificial lamb. Nixon and the Nixon administration, and the Republican Party for that matter, now see the handwriting on the wall. Okay, they see what's going to happen. There's going to be an investigation. We're going to obstruct it to the best of our ability. We don't, under any circumstances, want to be the political party. The Republicans don't want to be the political party that has a president impeached. Okay, so we want to obstruct this. What we need to do is we need to obstruct the investigation. Then Nixon's going to have to resign. Then whoever comes after Nixon, which will be his vice president, will pardon him for everything he's done. And that'll be the end of it. The party will be whitewashed. Okay, that's the idea anyways. And so they present this kind of, I hate to say it, but this kind of hapless nobody. Gerald Ford is kind of laughable in history because Gerald Ford, who was an ex-football player at the University of Michigan, also happened to be a klutz. So there's lots of film footage of him. Like there's one, I can remember it really vividly. There's one of him, this is back in the days of when they had the aircraft, they would run the ladder out to it. There's one of him tripping down the last 3 steps of the ladder and falling on his behind. There's lots of those. There's film of him tripping up the White House steps, things like that. Okay, so Ford was kind of a hapless dupe. Ford was selected. Spiro Agnew resigned, and Ford was selected specifically so that when Nixon resigned, Ford would take over, and Ford would pardon Nixon, okay, for, as you see there, any crimes committed or which may have been committed, which means that there was no admission that Nixon was guilty of anything, okay, he's just pardoned, okay, if you don't know he's guilty, why would you pardon him? But they pardon him, okay, well, the Republican Party knows, and this is why they select Ford, they know that that's going to cost Ford any chance he has at a presidential run, okay. He's a dead-in-the-water candidate from that point forward because the American people want someone to be held accountable for what's going on. Not just for the Watergate scandal, but for everything else in the country. And ultimately, Harry S. Truman said it right. The buck stops here. If you want to hold someone accountable, you hold the president accountable. Okay? So when Ford pardons Nixon, the American people realize there's going to be no accountability. No one's going to be held accountable for this. To this day, nobody has been held accountable. Now, Haldeman and Ehrlichman both served time in jail for the break-in, but nobody's been held accountable for the overall cover-up, okay? And what this leaves is this is kind of the legacy of Watergate. There was a time, back in the 40s, back in the 50s, even in the 60s, okay, where the American people trusted their government. Now, we saw under the Johnson administration that the credibility of the government was severely undermined by Johnson, who continually told the American people that the U.S. was doing really well in Vietnam, the Viet Cong were on their last legs, etc., etc. Okay, we talked about that before. Well, this is going to be another blow to the credibility of the U.S. government in the eyes of the American people. Okay? And Carter is going to have to live with that legacy, and it actually is a legacy that's going to continue to this day. Now, as far as Carter's concerned, in terms of effectiveness, Carter was one of the least effective presidents in American history. He's been much more effective out of office than in office. In other words, the time since he's been out of office. He's very influential in the movement that you may have heard of it called the Habitat for Humanity. Okay, he's very influential in that. He will really offer no significant solution to the condition of stagflation that's taking place. In fact, the one initiative he really launches, for which he's known, which we're going to look at in just a second here, actually is going to exacerbate the situation. It's going to make it worse. And then again, we saw before with the introduction of the Carter Doctrine, a series of foreign policy reversals for the United States during Carter's term. The one thing for which Carter is well known is his energy policy. He will, among other things, create the Department of Energy under Carter. The Department of Energy will be created under Carter. Now, every president before Carter, and actually as it works out, every president after Carter, has at least rhetorically put forth the idea of reducing U.S. dependency on foreign oil. Okay? And you see here, since 73, the oil embargo, U.S. imports of oil had increased by 65% a year. This was one of the main causes of the stagflation, was this increase in demand for oil by the United States, which drove prices up still further. Okay? By 76, you see the U.S. consumed 1/4 of all OPEC production. Now, remember that the OPEC embargo that began in 73 didn't last forever. And OAPEC is not the same as OPEC. OAPEC is a subdivision of OPEC. It's the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. The other members of OPEC didn't go along with the embargo. Okay? And this is why Carter's energy policy was ultimately counterproductive. Okay? He reduced the supply of energy immediately. Okay? In other words, he put money into research and development. He reduced the importation of oil, moving in the direction of wind power, solar power, nuclear power, etc. Okay? Well, that immediate, and the idea was we drop down energy costs immediately, put our money into research and development. We come up with more efficient energy sources that will reduce U.S. dependency on foreign oil. Okay? Well, the problem is that immediately the effect that's going to have is to reduce energy supplies still further, at a time when you're already suffering from double-digit inflation. This is going to push the inflation rate actually very close to 20%, which is nearing runaway inflation. Okay? And his ineffectiveness at that, and his ineffectiveness at foreign policy, particularly his failure to solve the Iran hostage situation, which I'd mentioned earlier, and a number of other reversals, is going to cost him the presidency. And he will lose in his reelection. He'll be an incumbent president that loses. He's a one-termer. And he'll lose to Ronald Reagan. And the instant that Reagan comes in, hope is actually restored, and particularly in the foreign policy realm, almost to the day. In fact, it is the day that Reagan comes into office. The Iranian government orders the release of the hostages that had been taken in the U.S. Embassy. And that concludes the lecture on the 1970s.